They tell you that you can't run from your problems, that they'll follow you wherever you go. I figured I'd put that theory to the test. I wanted to find a place so quiet, so remote, that the ghosts of my past wouldn't be able to find a foothold. A place where the only voice I'd have to hear was my own. And even that, I hoped, would eventually fall silent, drowned out by the sheer scale of the wilderness. That's how I ended up applying for a job that most people would consider a special kind of prison. Fire lookout for the Shadow Peak sector in Montana. 3 months, 92 days to be exact, alone in a glass box on top of a mountain. For me, it sounded like freedom. My name is Leo. When the Forest Service ranger, a grizzled man named Hank with a handshake like a vice grip, dropped me at the trailhead, he gave me a long, searching look. "You sure about this, son?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "The quiet up there, it does things to people. It ain't for everyone." I just nodded, hoisting my pack onto my shoulders. "The quiet is what I'm here for," I told him. He just grunted, got back in his dusty green truck, and drove away, leaving me in a cloud of dust and the deep, humming silence of the forest. The tower was another 2 miles up a steep, winding trail. It was a climb that was meant to strip you down, to make you earn the view. With every step, I felt the world I was leaving behind get smaller and smaller, the weight in my chest getting just a little bit lighter. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw it, I stopped. It was a stark, beautiful thing. A small square room walled in glass, perched on a 100-foot-tall metal skeleton, a lonely sentinel watching over an ocean of trees. The first few days were a kind of paradise. I fell into a simple monastic rhythm. I woke with the sun, the first rays of dawn warming the wooden floor of the cupola. I'd make coffee on my small propane stove, the smell of it mingling with the crisp pine scent of the air. Then I would begin my watch. In the center of the room was the Osborne Firefinder, my only real tool. It was a large circular map of my entire territory with a rotating metal sight that I would use to pinpoint the exact location of any smoke I saw. Every half hour, I would make a slow 360-degree sweep of the horizon, north, east, south, west. My eyes would trace the deep green valleys, the jagged gray ridges, and the endless expanse of the sky. The silence was everything I had hoped for. It was a thick, physical presence. During the day, it was filled with the gentle sounds of nature, the buzz of an insect against the window, the distant cry of a hawk, the whisper of the wind. At night, the silence deepened, and the sky came alive. With no city lights for 100 miles in any direction, the stars were a brilliant, shocking spectacle. The Milky Way was a bright, shimmering river painted across the blackness. It made me feel infinitesimally small, and for the first time in years, that felt like a comfort. My only connection to the outside world was a two-way radio on the desk. Every morning at 8 sharp, I'd check in with a disembodied voice from dispatch. "Shadow Peak, this is dispatch. Morning check-in." I'd reply, "Dispatch, this is Shadow Peak. All clear, visibility is excellent." The exchange was brief, professional, and reassuring. It was a reminder that civilization still existed, even if I didn't want any part of it. It was on the second week that I first heard it. It was late, well after midnight. A thunderstorm was rolling in far to the south, and I was watching the silent, beautiful flashes of lightning illuminate the clouds on the horizon. The radio was on, the volume turned low, just emitting a soft, steady hiss of static. It was a sound I'd come to find soothing, the sound of nothing. But then, something cut through it. It was a pulse, faint, rhythmic, and clean. It wasn't the crackle of lightning or the random noise of atmospheric interference. This was structured. Beep, 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 beep. A short pause, and then it repeated. Beep, 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 beep. I sat up, turning the squelch knob to try and isolate the frequency. The sound became clearer, a perfect digital tone that felt utterly alien out here in the heart of the wild. It was coming from a dead channel, a frequency that should have been empty. My first thought was that it was an emergency beacon from a downed aircraft, but it didn't match any known pattern. It was too slow, too simple, yet too complex in its rhythm. I listened for over an hour as it continued its steady hypnotic transmission, an unwavering pulse in the heart of the storm. Finally, I switched the radio off. The room was plunged back into a profound silence, but it wasn't the peaceful, comforting silence I'd come to love. The silence felt different. It felt like an empty stage, like a held breath. The signal was gone, but the impression of it was burned into my mind. The wilderness had been my sanctuary, a place of pure, natural order. Now, something unnatural had whispered into it, and I had the terrible feeling that I was the only one who had heard it.
Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the phantom echo of that signal, a ghost in my own head. Beep, 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 beep. It was a clean, sterile sound, completely out of place in a world made of wood, rock, and wind. When dawn finally broke, painting the horizon in soft pastels, it felt less like a new day and more like a reprieve. I made my coffee, my hands moving through the familiar motions of my routine, but my mind was elsewhere. The silence I had craved now felt unnervingly loud. It was a canvas, and last night, something had painted a single strange stroke across it. I found myself listening, not to the silence itself, but to what might be hiding within it. During my morning sweep, my eyes were sharper, more focused. I wasn't just looking for smoke anymore. I was looking for something, anything out of the ordinary. A broken branch, a patch of disturbed earth, a glint of reflected light that shouldn't be there. But there was nothing. The forest was a vast, impassive green blanket, holding its secrets as tightly as it always had. When the radio crackled to life at 8 o'clock, I flinched. "Shadow Peak, this is dispatch. Morning check-in." The woman's voice, usually a comfort, now felt like an intrusion. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the transmit button. What would I say? I heard a strange beeping last night? They'd ask for specifics I didn't have. They'd think I was cracking, another lonely soul getting spooked by the shadows. The quiet, I remembered Hank saying, does things to people. I didn't want to be one of those people. "Dispatch, this is Shadow Peak," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of my inner turmoil. "All clear, visibility is excellent." The day passed in a haze of doubt. I scanned the radio frequencies, turning the dial with a surgeon's precision, listening intently to the static between the channels. I heard nothing. I told myself it was the storm, a freak atmospheric event. A shortwave radio signal from halfway across the world bounced off the clouds and into my receiver for a short while. It was a logical, sane explanation, and I tried my best to believe it. I chopped wood, I read my book, I watched the clouds drift by. I did all the normal things, hoping normalcy would be contagious. But when night fell, a new kind of anticipation fell with it. I left the radio on the same dead channel from the night before, the volume just high enough to hear the soft hiss. The sky was perfectly clear this time, a deep, star-dusted indigo. There was no storm to blame, no atmospheric disturbance. There was only me, the stars, and the silence. For hours, that's all there was. I started to relax, convincing myself I had imagined it, or that it was a one-time fluke. And then, at 1:14 a.m., I know the exact time because I was logging it in my journal. It returned. Beep, 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 beep. It was identical, the same clean tone, the same precise rhythm. It wasn't a fluke. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stood up and walked to the glass, my hands pressed against the cool pane, and stared out into the impenetrable darkness of the valley below. I was listening to the signal, but I was looking for a source, a light, anything. The signal pulsed from the radio behind me, a steady, rhythmic beat in the dark. And on the fourth repetition, I saw it. It was so faint I almost missed it. A tiny pinprick of pale white light deep in the valley to the northwest. It flashed for less than a second, perfectly in sync with the last 3 beeps of the transmission. beep, beep, beep. Flash, flash, flash. Then darkness. I held my breath, waiting. 20 seconds later, the signal pulsed again from the radio. I stared at the exact spot in the valley, my eyes straining. And there it was. Beep, beep, beep. Flash, flash, flash. A silent, visual echo to the sound I was hearing. My training kicked in. Without taking my eyes off the spot, I moved to the Osborne Firefinder. I swiveled the metal alidade, peering through the sights, and lined it up with the location of the phantom light. My hands were trembling slightly. I waited for 2 more cycles, confirming the location each time the light pulsed. Once I was sure, I locked the finder in place and looked at the map. The coordinates it gave me were in the heart of the Coulter's Deep, a section of the valley that was notoriously dense and inaccessible. There were no trails, no roads, no hunting cabins. On the map, it was just a blank, green space. A void. I stood there for a long time, the rhythmic pulse of the radio filling the room. I was no longer just a lookout. I was a witness. This wasn't just a random signal. It was a conversation, and for reasons I could possibly imagine, I was the only one in the world who seemed to be intercepting it.
The sun rose, but it brought no comfort. The world outside my glass box was as beautiful and serene as ever, but my perception of it had fundamentally changed. I was no longer looking at a simple landscape of trees and rock. I was looking at a hiding place. Down in the impenetrable green of Coulter's Deep, a secret was breathing, and it had pulsed at me in the dark. My morning routine was a blur, an automatic process my body went through while my mind was miles away, fixed on a single set of coordinates. I spent an hour just staring at the map, at the small penciled X I had marked. Coulter's Deep. The name itself sounded ancient and forbidding. According to the topographical lines, the terrain was a nightmare, a chaotic jumble of steep ravines and dense old-growth forest that had likely never seen a logger's axe. It was the kind of place that could swallow something whole and keep it for 1,000 years. I knew that asking about it was a risk, but ignorance felt even more dangerous. At the 8 a.m. check-in, I tried to make my voice sound as casual and professional as possible. "Dispatch, this is Shadow Peak. Morning check-in is all clear." I paused for a beat. "Quick question for you, Sarah. The chart for my sector has a note about geological surveys from the 70s. Do you have any data on record for the Coulter's Deep area? I'm seeing some terrain features that don't quite line up with my map." It was a weak lie, but the best I could come up with. The radio hissed for a few moments. I could hear the faint sound of keyboard clicks. "Stand by, Shadow Peak," Sarah's voice came back, flat and uninterested. After a minute, she was back. "Negative, Shadow Peak. Our records show Coulter's Deep as a protected primitive wilderness area. No geological surveys, no trails, no private holdings. It's a blank spot on the map for a reason. Nothing goes in, nothing goes out. Stick to your smoke watch, Leo." Her words were meant to be procedural, a simple statement of fact. But to me, they sounded like a warning. A blank spot on the map. It was official confirmation. Whatever was down there was completely, utterly alone. And so was I. The day crawled by. I found myself obsessively scanning the northwest sector with my binoculars, sweeping over the canopy of Coulter's Deep until my eyes ached. I saw nothing but an endless sea of swaying treetops. It was absurd. What did I expect to see? A hatch opening in the forest floor? But I couldn't help it. I felt a pull towards that spot on the map, a dangerous, magnetic curiosity. Nightfall came with a sense of inevitability. I didn't wonder if the signal would return. I knew it would. I was ready for it, sitting at my desk with my logbook, the radio humming quietly, tuned to the dead channel. As the clock ticked past 1 a.m., the anticipation in the small room was so thick I could feel it. And right on schedule, at 1:14 a.m., my vigil was rewarded. Beep, 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 beep. The sound was familiar now, almost expected. I raised my binoculars to the window, already aimed at Coulter's Deep. On the fourth cycle, the pinprick of light flashed in the darkness, a silent accomplice to the sound in my ears. Flash, flash, flash. It was all the same, but I had a hunch. My gut told me this wasn't just a two-way conversation. So this time, I didn't just stare at the light. I watched the surrounding area. I let my eyes scan the other dark ridges and peaks that framed the horizon. For 10 minutes, the call and response continued. The signal from my radio, the light from the valley. A perfect closed loop. Then, just as I was starting to think I was wrong, I saw it. On a different mountain range, far to the northeast, another light appeared. It was much fainter, a barely perceptible flicker. It pulsed only once. A long, slow pulse of pale light that lasted for about 3 seconds before vanishing. It was a completely different signature. It wasn't a response. It felt like an acknowledgement, a sign-off. My blood ran cold. This was bigger than I thought. Moving with a deliberate calm I didn't feel, I swiveled the firefinder towards this new light, aligning the sights with the distant peak. I locked it down and looked at my map. I made a second X. I sat back in my chair and stared at the map under the soft glow of my desk lamp. There was my own tower, Shadow Peak, circled in the south. There was the first X in the valley to the northwest, and now a second X on a ridge to the northeast. I took my pencil, and with a shaky hand, I drew a straight line connecting the 2 points of light. Then I drew lines from each of those points to my own location. A perfect scalene triangle. I wasn't just listening in on a conversation anymore. I was inside of it, a silent, unwitting observer, sitting at one corner of a vast secret geometry that was drawn across the sleeping wilderness.
The triangle on the map haunted me. It was no longer a piece of paper and pencil. It was a schematic of my new reality. I was a point within a system I didn't understand, a silent partner in a transaction of light and sound. The idea of sleep became a joke. Instead, I spent the hours before dawn with a fresh logbook, documenting everything I could remember from the past nights with a forensic obsession. Times, frequencies, the estimated duration of the light pulses, the exact azimuth readings from the firefinder. I was no longer a fire lookout escaping his past. I was an intelligence analyst in a glass cage, watching a silent, secret war. My day is transformed. The Forest Service routine became a cover for my real work. While my official log showed dutiful scans for smoke, my binoculars were almost permanently trained on 2 spots, the impenetrable canopy of Coulter's Deep and the barren, rocky ridge to the northeast. I scoured them, inch by inch, looking for anything, a glint of sunlight on metal, a strangely shaped shadow, any sign of an unnatural presence. I found nothing. The forest kept its secrets perfectly. The ridge was just bare rock. Whatever was out there was either impossibly small or impossibly well hidden. This new focus changed me. The solitude I had once cherished now felt like a vulnerability. The vast, beautiful wilderness no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. The silence was not peaceful. It was charged, brimming with unspoken things. I began to feel a constant, low-grade paranoia. I'd catch myself scanning the trees not for smoke, but for lenses, for observers. I was a watcher who was becoming convinced he was also being watched. For 3 consecutive nights, the phenomenon repeated itself with the precision of a celestial event. At exactly 1:14 a.m., the transmission would begin on the dead channel. The light in Coulter's Deep would answer, and then the faint single pulse from the northeast ridge would sign off. The pattern was so reliable I could set my watch to it. It was a language, and I was slowly learning its grammar. The call, the response, the acknowledgement. On the 4th night, I was prepared. My logbook was open, my binoculars were ready, my eyes were fixed on the valley. The time came. 1:14 a.m. The radio crackled to life with its familiar sterile pulse. Beep, 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 beep. I held my breath, my gaze locked on the spot in Coulter's Deep. I waited for the answering flash. Nothing. The valley remained a pit of absolute blackness. The radio sent out its signal again. Beep, 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 beep. Still no reply. The sound coming from the speaker felt different now. Stripped of its counterpart, it no longer sounded like a communication. It sounded like a question, a persistent, unanswered call echoing in the dark. It repeated again and again, each cycle deepening the knot of dread in my stomach. Something was wrong. The routine was broken. I forgot about Coulter's Deep and instinctively swung my binoculars towards the northeast ridge, the location of the observer. For minutes, it remained as dark as the valley. The signal continued its lonely, unanswered call. Then it happened. The ridge exploded with light. It wasn't the faint, gentle pulse of the previous nights. This was a brilliant, focused beam of pure white light, impossibly powerful, cutting through the darkness like a surgeon's scalpel. It wasn't aimed at the sky. It was aimed low, sweeping across the landscape. My mind screamed searchlight, but it was brighter than any man-made light I had ever seen. It moved with an unnerving intelligence, methodically scanning the forest. It swept over Coulter's Deep, illuminating the tops of the ancient pines for a brief, ghostly moment. And then the beam began to rise. It climbed the slope of my own mountain with a terrifying speed. Before I could react, before I could even process what was happening, it was on me. My world vanished in a flood of sterile, clinical white. The light slammed into my tower, turning my dark, private world into a blindingly lit stage. Every corner of the room, every detail of the map, every line on my face was instantly, brutally exposed. It wasn't a searching sweep. It felt like an accusation. For a heart-stopping second, the beam held steady on my tower, and in that moment, I knew. They knew I was here. They knew I was listening. The Watcher was now the Watched.
The beam of light was gone as suddenly as it had appeared, plunging me back into a darkness that felt deeper and more threatening than before. I lay on the rough wooden floor, my cheek pressed against the splinters, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room was thick with the afterimage of that blinding, sterile white light. For several minutes I didn't move, convinced that any motion would bring the light sweeping back. I was no longer a man in a watchtower. I was a specimen under a microscope, and something had just seen me squirm. My first coherent thought was a primal one: silence the source. Scrambling on my hands and knees, I crawled to the desk, keeping my head below the level of the windows. My hand, trembling violently, fumbled for the radio's power switch. I flicked it off. The faint green glow of the display died, and the soft hiss of the speaker vanished. The silence that filled the void was absolute, but it was a hostile, predatory silence. It was the silence of something holding its breath. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner furthest from the windows, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, making myself as small as possible. The beautiful glass walls of my sanctuary had become a terrifying vulnerability. Every star seemed like a watching eye, every gust of wind against the glass like a probing touch. The wilderness I had run to for peace had become the source of a profound and deeply personal terror. The next morning, the sun rose with an almost mocking brilliance. The world outside was vibrant and alive, utterly indifferent to my night of fear. Going through my morning routine was an act of supreme will. When the 8 a.m. check-in came in, I answered it, my voice a strained, hollow version of its usual self. "All clear," I lied, my eyes scanning the serene, sun-drenched canopy of Coulter's Deep. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my chest. All clear. I was sitting in the middle of a secret that could rewrite human history, and I was reporting fair weather and good visibility. The day was a long, slow torture. Every shadow seemed to move with intent. I flinched at the sound of a raven's call. Paranoia was now my constant companion. I ate nothing. I just drank coffee and watched, waiting for nightfall with a mixture of dread and a grim, fatalistic curiosity. I had made a decision. I would not be a participant tonight. My radio would remain off. I would not listen. I would sever my connection to the triangle. I reasoned with the flawed logic of a terrified man that if I couldn't hear them, maybe they would forget I was here. As dusk settled, I didn't light my lamp. I sat in the growing darkness, a silent observer in a silent tower. I let the hours tick by, tracking the slow march of the constellations across the sky. Midnight came and went. I watched the clock on the wall, its faint ticking the only sound. 1:10, 1:12, 1:13. I held my breath, waiting for the moment of the scheduled transmission. 1:14 a.m. arrived in dead silence. My radio was off, lifeless on the desk. I felt a small, foolish surge of relief. Maybe that was it. Maybe I had broken the circuit. But then I felt it. A low, resonant vibration that started in the soles of my feet and traveled up my spine. It was a sound that was felt as much as it was heard. A deep, powerful hum, like a colossal engine waking from a long slumber far beneath the earth. The wooden frame of the tower trembled with it. It was not coming from a speaker, it was coming from the world itself. I scrambled to the window, my fear momentarily eclipsed by awe. The source of the hum was unmistakable. It was coming from the valley. And as I watched, a light began to grow in the heart of Coulter's Deep. It wasn't the small sharp pinprick from before. This was a vast, diffused glow that illuminated the forest from within. A soft, ethereal blue-green light that pulsed not with a rhythm, but with a slow, organic energy, like a living, breathing thing. It pushed up through the dense canopy, silhouetting the ancient trees and casting an otherworldly radiance on the clouds above. The secret was no longer hiding, it was broadcasting. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my attempt at silence hadn't made them go away. It had made them change their language.
The blue-green glow from the valley floor was a silent, luminous tide that held back the night. For hours, I stood glued to the glass, watching it. The hum was a constant presence, a vibration that seemed to have sunk into my bones, into the very foundation of the tower. It wasn't a mechanical noise, it felt deeper, more ancient. It was the sound of something immense, shifting in its sleep. I watched, transfixed, until the first hint of dawn began to bleach the eastern sky. As the natural light grew, the unnatural glow in the valley slowly receded, and the hum faded with it, sinking back into the earth, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and expectant. I was at a crossroads. The last vestiges of the man who had climbed these stairs seeking peace were gone, burned away by a searchlight and shaken apart by a subterranean hum. In his place was someone else, a man with a secret so monumental it was threatening to fracture his sanity. My duty was clear: report any unusual phenomena. But my training manual didn't have a chapter for humming, glowing forests. If I radioed in what I had seen, my time on Shadow Peak would be over in a matter of hours. They'd send a helicopter, haul me out, and put me in a quiet room for a long, long talk. The official report would be stress-induced hallucination. The secret of Coulter's Deep would be buried under a mountain of psychiatric evaluations, and the world would keep spinning, blissfully unaware. I couldn't let that happen. But I couldn't stay here either. To sit in this glass cage and wait for the light to return, to wait for the next escalation, felt like a surrender.
The paranoia of the last few days had been replaced by a grim, terrifying resolve. The triangle on my map was no longer a schematic of a mystery. It was an invitation. I wasn't just a witness anymore. The light that had swept over my tower had made me a part of the equation, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic and self-preservation, that I had to go down there. I had to see what was at the heart of that glow. My decision was reckless, a violation of every rule in my contract, but it felt like the only choice I had left. I needed a window, a period of time where my silence wouldn't raise any alarms. My eyes fell on the weather forecast pinned to the wall. A major storm system was predicted to move in within the next day. It was the perfect cover. I spent the day preparing, my movements precise and deliberate. I laid out my topographical map of the valley, tracing a path into Coulter's Deep that was hypothetical at best, following game trails and creek beds that might not even exist. I packed a small, durable backpack with everything I could need for a 2-day trek: a coil of rope, a compass, a water filter, high-energy rations, and a first aid kit. It all felt terribly inadequate. The next morning, with the sky turning a bruised, ominous gray, I made the call. I held the transmit button, my heart pounding. "Dispatch, this is Shadow Peak with a status update." "Go ahead, Shadow Peak," voice replied. "Dispatch, the leading edge of this storm is hitting us hard up here at the tower. We had a lightning strike somewhere near the tower a few minutes ago. All my comms are acting up. This broadcast is full of static. I think the antenna might be damaged. I'm going to have to power down the equipment to prevent a surge. I may be off air until this system passes and I can safely conduct a full inspection." There was a pause. "Understood, Shadow Peak. Keep safe up there. Report back in when you can." "Will do," I said, and then I switched the radio off. 48-hour window. That's what I had. 2 days of complete, authorized silence. I stood at the door of the cupola, my pack weighing heavily on my shoulders. I took one last look around the small room that had been my sanctuary, and then my prison. My gaze rested on the map, on the triangle I had drawn. It looked like a treasure map to a place no human was ever meant to find. I opened the door, and the wind hit me with a chilling force. The sky was dark, pregnant with the coming storm. I turned my back on the tower and began to descend the 137 steps, each step taking me further from my post, further from safety, and deeper into the mystery.
Leaving the clean, open air of the tower was like plunging into another world. On the ground, the vast panoramic view I had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a suffocating green and brown prison. The mist clung to everything, deadening sound and reducing visibility to 50 feet in any direction. The million-acre forest I had watched over from above had shrunk to the space of a small room. I was no longer an eye in the sky. I was just a man, small and vulnerable, trespassing on ancient ground. The first few hours were a brutal lesson in the difference between a map and the land it represents. The path I had traced was a fantasy. There were no gentle slopes, only steep, treacherous ravines choked with thorny undergrowth that tore at my clothes and skin. I relied on my compass, keeping the needle pointed northwest, forcing my way through the wilderness with a grim determination. The air was thick, humid, and still, heavy with the promise of the coming storm. It was the silence that began to truly unnerve me. This deep in the woods, there should have been a symphony of life, the chatter of squirrels, the chirping of unseen birds, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. But there was nothing. The forest was holding its breath. The only sounds were my own ragged breathing, the snap of twigs under my boots, and the thumping of my own heart. It was a dead, watchful silence, and it felt profoundly wrong. As I pressed deeper into the sector I had marked as Coulter's Deep, the wrongness grew. The forest itself began to change. The trees, ancient and massive, were subtly warped. Their trunks, which should have grown straight towards the sky, were bent in gentle, uniform curves, as if they had spent centuries leaning away from a central point, recoiling from an energy I could not see. It was a silent, botanical scream. I scrambled down the side of a steep embankment to a shallow, fast-moving creek. As I knelt to refill my canteen, I noticed the stones in the creek bed. They were all unnaturally smooth and dark, polished to a dull sheen like river rocks tumbled for 1,000 years, yet the creek was too small and weak for that kind of erosion. I dipped my hand into the water. It was cool, but the stones beneath it were warm, radiating a faint, steady heat. I snatched my hand back, a fresh wave of fear washing over me. I pulled out my compass to reorient myself. The needle, which had been my only reliable guide, was useless. It spun erratically, twitching back and forth before beginning to rotate in a slow, steady circle. Some powerful, or perhaps not magnetic force was emanating from the heart of the valley, and it had just stolen my sense of direction. I was blind. The sky above, visible only in small patches through the canopy, had turned the color of slate. The wind began to moan through the warped trees, and the first fat, cold drops of rain began to spatter on the leaves around me. The storm was here. I needed to find shelter, but I was completely, terrifyingly lost. Pushing through a thick wall of dripping ferns, desperate for any kind of landmark, I stumbled out of the tree line and froze. I had found the center. It was a clearing, roughly circular and unnervingly barren. Nothing grew here. The ground was a carpet of the same smooth, dark stones from the creek bed. And in the middle of the clearing, half buried in the earth and canted at a severe angle, was the source. It was not a ship. It was not a machine. It was a colossal, monolithic structure made of a material as black as a starless sky. Its surface was perfectly smooth, non-reflective, seeming to drink the dim, stormy light. Intricate, geometric lines, like the circuits of some alien god, were carved into its surface, pulsing with a faint, internal blue-green light, the very same light I had seen from the tower. As the rain began to fall in earnest, plastering my hair to my forehead, I could only stand and stare at the impossible thing that slept in the heart of the forest. I had come seeking the source of a signal, but I had found something entirely else. I had found an altar or a tomb.
The rain was a cold, driving sheet, plastering my clothes to my skin in seconds. I stood at the edge of the clearing, paralyzed by the sight before me. The monolith wasn't just in the forest. It felt like the forest had been born around it, had recoiled from it, leaving this barren, circular wound in the earth. It was ancient, alien, and utterly silent, yet it felt more alive than anything else in this dead stretch of woods. The storm was growing worse, the wind tearing at the treetops with a furious roar. I needed shelter, and the only shelter in this forsaken place was the very thing that radiated a quiet, cosmic dread. My body, driven by a primal need for survival that briefly overrode my fear, began to move. I walked slowly into the clearing, my boots crunching on the smooth, dark stones. As I got closer, the air grew thick with a palpable energy. A low hum vibrated, not just in my ears, but in my chest, a physical pressure that pushed against my ribs. The rain, I now saw, was not hitting the monolith. It hissed and turned to steam a few inches from the black surface, creating a shimmering, protective aura around the impossible object. The monolith was canted over at such a sharp angle that it created a wide, triangular overhang, a perfect slice of shelter from the downpour. I ducked under it, pressing my back against the cold, damp earth of the crater wall it had carved. I was now inches from its surface. Up close, it was flawless, without a single scratch or seam. It didn't feel manufactured,
It felt grown, and I was overwhelmed by a sense of time that staggered my imagination. This thing had been here long before the trees, long before the mountains themselves had settled. The blue-green light from the geometric patterns pulsed with a soft, slow rhythm, casting a faint, otherworldly glow. I watched the lines, mesmerized. They were a language, I was sure of it, a language of light and form. And in that moment, my fear was eclipsed by an irresistible, all-consuming need to understand. My hand, acting of its own accord, lifted from my side. My fingers trembled as I reached out across the small gap. I knew I shouldn't. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to pull back, to run. I ignored it. And the moment my fingertips brushed against the smooth, dry surface, the world ended. It wasn't an electric shock, it was a detonation of consciousness. The forest, the storm, my own body, it all vanished, replaced by a torrent of pure, raw information that flooded the deepest parts of my mind. There were no words, only absolutes. I saw a sky ablaze with a violet nebula. I felt the gravitational pull of a gas giant with rings of crystalline ice. I witnessed the silent, graceful construction of cities that defied physics, built by beings of pure energy. Then came the fall, a flash of catastrophic, searing light, a feeling of being torn, of screaming in a vacuum. I felt the agony of a 1,000-year fall through the cold, empty darkness of interstellar space. I felt the violent, fiery impact with a young, primitive world. And then, nothing. Only silence, darkness, and a profound, crushing loneliness. A loneliness that spanned geological ages, a desperate, patient waiting in the dark. It was the mind of a castaway, a prisoner, a survivor, and it was trapped in a broken, dying vessel. Just as quickly as it began, it was over. I was thrown backward, landing hard on the muddy ground outside the overhang. I gasped, sucking in the rain-soaked air, my mind a screaming chaos. The vision, the experience, was already fragmenting, dissolving like a dream upon waking. But the feeling, the core emotion remained. The soul-crushing weight of absolute, endless solitude. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, my body shaking, my head throbbing. The storm raged around me. I looked at the monolith. The faint, blue-green glow in its patterns was no longer soft. It was pulsing brightly, insistently, a slow, steady rhythm. Thump-thump, thump-thump. A heartbeat. And I finally understood everything. The rhythmic pulse I'd heard on the radio, the beep, 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 beep. It wasn't a conversation. It was this, a heartbeat. A distress call from a shattered consciousness broadcasting its agony into the void for millennia. The watchers on the ridge weren't its partners, they were its jailers. And I, a lost and broken man looking for silence, was the first person in 10,000 years to get close enough to hear it. By touching it, I had let it know its call had finally been answered.
I lay in the mud, the cold rain washing over me, the phantom sensations of another star system slowly fading from my mind. All that remained was the echo of that profound, soul-shattering loneliness. It clung to me, a sorrow so immense it felt ancient. The being inside that stone, the prisoner, the castaway, was utterly and completely alone, and I had just touched its hand across an ocean of time. The pulsing blue-green heartbeat from the monolith felt like a direct response, a confirmation. I see you. I am here. A bond had been forged in that single electrifying moment. I was no longer an impartial observer. I was its ally. This realization was immediately followed by a wave of pure animal terror. The watchers on the ridge, the ones with the searchlight, they weren't just watching. They were guards, wardens, and I had just triggered every alarm in their silent cosmic prison. They would be coming. The thought jolted me to my feet. Staying here in this clearing was suicide. My only hope was the tower,
It was a fragile, exposed glass cage, but it was my only sanctuary, my only base. The journey back was a nightmare. The storm had turned the forest into a primal, chaotic world of whipping branches and torrential floods of muddy water. The ravines I had carefully climbed down were now raging, impassable rivers. My compass was useless, and my memory of the route was a blur. All I had was a desperate animal instinct, a need to move away from the monolith and toward the faint hope of safety. Hours bled into one another. I was running on pure adrenaline, my body numb to the cold and the dozens of cuts and bruises I'd collected. After what felt like an eternity of fighting through the maelstrom, I found myself on a high, wind-swept ridge that overlooked the valley. I risked a glance back. What I saw stopped my heart. The storm clouds above Coulter's Deep roiled with a sickly, unnatural light. The blue-green glow of the monolith was still pulsing, a steady, defiant heartbeat in the storm. But it was no longer alone. Descending silently from the churning cloud cover were two objects. They were not helicopters. They were craft, small and angular, made of the same non-reflective black material as the monolith. They moved with an impossible, silent grace, cutting through the gale-force winds as if they were nothing. They took up positions hovering directly above the clearing, their forms stark and menacing against the ethereal glow from below. Then, just as they had on the night they found me, they activated their lights. Two beams of harsh, clinical white light lanced down through the rain, pinning the clearing, pinning the monolith in a cage of light. The wardens had arrived. They were locking down their prison. The sight broke me from my trance. I was out of time. I scrambled down the other side of the ridge, falling and sliding through the mud, driven by a fear so profound it left no room for exhaustion. I ran, blindly, stupidly, until the familiar steep slope of Shadow Peak rose up before me. I had made it. The climb up the 137 steps was the hardest thing I have ever done. My legs were jelly, my lungs burned, but I hauled myself up, one agonizing step at a time. I burst into the cupola, slamming the door shut against the storm, and collapsed onto the floor, a shivering, soaked wreck. For a long time, I just lay there, the familiar room spinning around me. But the image of those black ships in their cage of light was burned into my mind. Hiding was not enough. My 48-hour window of silence was a joke. They knew I was here. They knew what I had done. Looking at the map, at the triangle that had once represented a mystery, I now saw only a battleground, and I was standing on one of its front lines. My duty was to my employer. My instinct was to save myself. But the empathy I felt for the lonely, shattered mind in the monolith overrode it all. It had cried out for help for thousands of years, and I was the one who heard it. I could not abandon it now. I pushed myself to my feet, dripping water under the floorboards, and walked to the desk. I looked at the radio, my hand poised over the power switch. My lie to dispatch bought me my life. Breaking that silence now would have unknown, terrifying consequences. But the silence was no longer an option. The wardens were in the valley. The prisoner was awake, and I had to make a choice.
I stood in the heart of my glass cage, the world outside a swirl of wind and rain. The chaos of the storm, however, felt distant, secondary to the storm that had finally settled within my own mind. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in control. My frantic escape through the forest had burned it down to its essential core, leaving behind a single, unshakable purpose. The being in the monolith had cried out, and I had answered. Now its wardens were here, and I could not, would not, stay silent. What was my plan? I had no weapon. I had no way to fight the silent black craft that even now were pinning their prisoner in a cage of light. My only tool was the very thing that had started it all, my radio. My only power was the truth. I walked to the desk, my movements now steady. My 48-hour alibi felt like a lifetime ago, a relic from a man who no longer existed.
My hand closed around the power knob on the radio. This time, there was no hesitation. I flicked it on. The green display glowed to life, a small beacon of defiance in the dim room. My fingers, slick with rain, moved to the frequency dial. I didn't tune to the Forest Service channel. I spun it past the weather reports and the ranger chatter to the dead, empty space where I had first heard the call. I picked up the transmitter. My thumb rested on the button. I wasn't going to speak. A frantic, unbelievable story from a man alone on a mountain would be dismissed as madness. But data is harder to ignore. I looked at the Osborne Firefinder, at the locked-in coordinates for the clearing in Coulter's Deep. It was the only concrete piece of evidence I had. It was the address of the prisoner. I pressed the transmit button. The speaker hissed, and I began to tap. I didn't send a plea for help. I didn't send a warning. I sent a location. Using the simple, universal language of Morse code, I began to broadcast the exact latitude and longitude of the monolith. ... Over and over, I tapped out the coordinates, my message a precise, undeniable statement of fact. This is here. This is real. It was a flare, shot into the global darkness of the radio waves, aimed at anyone and everyone who might be listening. I was taking their most guarded secret and turning it into a public broadcast. The effect was instantaneous. From the valley, the steady blue-green heartbeat of the monolith erupted. A silent, colossal wave of light and energy pulsed outwards from the clearing, a flash so brilliant it illuminated the underside of the storm clouds and turned my night-dark tower into day. It wasn't an attack, it was a roar, a shout of hope, of acknowledgement, of release. And for a fleeting second, I felt it in my mind again, not the crushing loneliness, but a feeling of profound, overwhelming gratitude that brought tears to my eyes. The wardens reacted with terrifying speed. Their harsh white searchlights snapped off. The two black craft, which had been stationary over the valley, pivoted in unison. They were no longer interested in their prisoner. They were interested in me. They moved with a speed that defied physics, two streaks of blackness against the storm, closing the miles to my tower in a matter of seconds. My fingers never stopped tapping. I kept sending the coordinates, my only and final act of defiance. The craft arrived, one on either side of my tower. They slowed to a dead halt, hovering just feet from the glass, so close I could see the flawless, seamless black material of their hulls. The wind from the storm was gone, replaced by the deep, vibrational hum of their engines. The world went silent. My broadcast was finished. The coordinates were out there. I had done it. The harsh white lights of the wardens did not return. Instead, a soft, ethereal blue-green glow began to emanate from the crafts themselves, the same light as the monolith. My small room was bathed in its beautiful alien radiance. I stood in the center of the cupola, caught between these two impossible machines, and I felt my fear finally, completely wash away. I looked from one silent craft to the other. I had stumbled into a conflict as old as the stars. I had chosen a side. I did not know if they had come to silence me or to understand me. I did not know if I had started a war or a rescue. I only knew that I was no longer alone in my tower, and the silence of the universe had finally been broken.